Most trophic dynamics are represented in terms of energy flow, yet often it's nutrients that are limiting to both plants and animals, representing that transfers of nutrients in trophic dynamics can be just as important as energy. The authors state that the pathway of nutrients through food chains is usually similar to that of energy. So when we take a look at the movement of nutrients from plants to herbivores and herbivores to carnivores, that pathway represents both energy and nutrients. And it's the same for nutrients as it is energy. The pyramids of nutrient transfers are therefore similar in shape to those of energy flow. So if we think about energy flow, for example, and instead we take the same ecosystem and represent nutrient transfers, it's often pretty similar. So energy to nutrient transfers ratios tend to be pretty constant as we work our way up, and therefore the pyramid that we represent trophic dynamics with is pretty similar for nutrients as energy. One exception, though, is sodium. And the reason for that is that sodium is the one element that's required by animals that's not required by plants. If you take a look at the sodium concentrations in plants, they're often a lot lower than you would expect based on other elements. Plants actively work to exclude sodium often from their leaves, and it's the one element that you'll find in lower concentrations in leaves as you would roots, for example. So sodium often cycles a little bit differently through an ecosystem than other elements such as nitrogen or phosphorus. Instead of getting sodium from plants, often sodium is going to be acquired in salt licks. So here's Bison and Wind Cave, and this is a natural salt lick that you can see, and this is an area where bison are going to congregate and acquire sodium directly from the abiotic environment. So these mineral licks are places where animals are directly going to access minerals. Many animals actually acquire elements from the abiotic environment instead of from plants. And in addition to bison, if we take a look at wild herbivores in South Africa, this is a photo from Palani's Game Reserve in South Africa, we can see giraffe and wildebeest acquiring sodium from mineral licks that are present. And this is just a giant rock of salt that animals are going to use as a source of sodium. And the reason is that although they can get enough energy and other nutrients from leaves and grass, for example, sodium is actually really hard to come by, and often you'll need salt licks to do that. A larger proportion of the nutrients contained in plant production pass through terrestrial herbivores than is the case for energy. So put in other terms, if we take a look at the efficiency of consumption going from plants to herbivores, and we calculate that for energy, and we're going to calculate that for, say, nitrogen, that the consumption efficiency is a lot higher. So a lot greater proportion of the nutrients that are incorporated into plant biomass make it into the herbivores as opposed to energy. Now often, herbivores are going to be more nutrient limited than they are energy limited, and they're going to do things that are going to increase the proportion of nutrients that they get from plants as opposed to energy. The consequence of this often is to speed up the nutrient cycle. And we're going to go through 3 different ways that herbivores are going to speed up the nutrient cycle. So first, herbivores select nutrient-rich tissues. They select nutrient-rich plants and also these tissues. So if you take a look at the average nitrogen concentration that you would find in the plants altogether for an ecosystem, some of those plants are going to be pretty low, some of them are going to be high, and it's the plants with high nutrient concentrations, and it's the parts of the plants with high nutrient concentrations that herbivores are going to select. Herbivores would rather eat leaves than they would wood, and they would rather eat young leaves than they would old leaves, since young leaves have higher nutrient concentrations than older leaves. So herbivores select nutrient-rich tissues, both by selecting for the plants that have higher nutrient concentrations, but also the parts of the plants that have higher nutrient concentrations. Herbivores can also speed up nutrient cycling because they return nutrients faster than plants do. Plants resorb a portion of their nutrients, so even though their tissues might have relatively high nutrient concentrations in them, some of them they're going to pull back into the plant. And For herbivores, by consuming leaves before nutrient resorption occurs, a greater proportion of the nutrient contained in that leaf is going to enter into the next trophic level. Whereas plants would generally remove at least half of those nutrients before senescing those leaves and having them enter into the decomposition cycle. Another factor here is actually the digestive system of animals. And if you're to compare the rate at which material is processed inside of an animal, compare that to that same amount of leaf instead going into the detritus system and being decomposed. Because of the environment that's inside of an organism, it tends to be warmer, it tends to be wetter, and it tends to be a really good system for microbial processing. That processing of that organic matter is a lot faster inside of an herbivore than it is in the environment itself. Environments tend to be dry, and for other reasons decomposition is a lot slower than microbial processing is in organisms. So those nutrients get returned faster going through herbivores than they would if it was just going through plants. Lastly, herbivores are going to return nutrients in forms that can be directly absorbed by plants. When plants senesce leaves, you're going to have a mix of carbon and nitrogen, for example, that enters into the decomposition cycle. Herbivores, on the other hand, urinate. And so they're going to return inorganic nitrogen, for example, or phosphorus, in a form that's directly absorbable by plants. So there's no further decomposition that has to happen before plants take those up.